Welcome. This is Mr. Kira's AP Gov review of Congress and the legislative branch. I hope you're happy, healthy, and safe. In this video, we're going to quickly take a look at the powers of Congress found in Article 1, its limits, as well as how it works. So let's get started. So it doesn't take much to see Congress in full action. You just turn on the news today, your social media posts, your TikTok, and you'll see plenty of stories, things happening today, and how they are trying to directly or indirectly change your life.
The app coming to the attention of several U.S. senators worried that TikTok could be a target of foreign manipulation after Russia's attempts to interfere with the 2016 U.S. election through Facebook. Senator Marco Rubio calling for a review, saying China could be amassing data on millions of unspecified users.
So the Congress, or the legislative branch, it's considered the first branch because it's in Article 1 of the Constitution. It's created by America's founding fathers, the framers of the Constitution. And among other things, Congress is supposed to make laws on your behalf and to be, in a sense, the voice of the people, or your voice, meaning they are supposed to represent you and your ideas, what you believe make the community that you live in, your school, your life, your country, and even your future better than it already may be. So Congress has been operating for now about 230 years, basically since the Constitution was ratified in 1789. And it begs the question, and this is something you'll have to ask yourself, how do you think they are representing you specifically and the future you want to live in? So if you look at the top left, you'll see a beautiful scene. It's the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., D.C. being District of Columbia, and it's the 4th of July. It's beautiful, and I do recommend you go there if you get a chance. You can actually enter the building, take a tour. It's a beautiful building. Interestingly, at the moment, if you look at Congress is actually hovering between about 20 to 30% approval ratings. It's not, and that's nationally, by the way, and it's not exactly very good. So, we can look at this and it says apparently more popular than Congress are car salesmen and the band Nickelback. So they are not very popular. In fact, they have the lowest approval ratings of all three branches of government. Even currently, the President Trump has actually higher approval ratings than that of Congress. In the slide, we see that the makeup of Congress is very diverse, but it does tend to be, relatively speaking, rich, white, male, sort of the old WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. But there has been, again, a divergence in that where minorities and women have become more and more incorporated. As we can see actually in this slide, Congress had only, 2011, 20% of Congress were made up of women, 80% men. And obviously, as we know, the current distribution of men to women are 50% in the population. So they are not very much represented. And it used to be a time where you had no women in Congress.
And what shall follow upon that? Universal enfranchisement? Votes for women?
The number one religion in Congress currently are Protestant Christians. But now there's also an incorporation of other types of Christians. President Obama was a Unitarian. Joe Biden is Roman Catholic, the same as, of course, JFK, who was assassinated. But we have Jewish members in Congress. We have 3 Muslim members in Congress, 2 females and 1 male. We have Buddhists and people of many different ethnicities. So with respect to Congress is part of, again, mentioned Article 1 of the Constitution. And the best way to remember this, by the way, is Article 1. Remember the acronym LEG or LEJ, L-E-J. L is for the Article 1, which is legislative. E is for executive, so it's Article 2. And J is judicial, so Article 3. So if you're trying to remember which one's which, just remember the acronym LEG or LEJ. And remember, the Constitution created what's called a representative form of government. You'll remember that in Athens, they had what's called a direct democracy, which means that the citizens of Athens voted on basically every single action, every single bill. It was a direct democracy. What we have is a republic or a representative government, meaning we do not vote on every single thing as citizens. Rather, we elect representatives to act on our behalf. So we have representatives, and so Congress is made specifically of the House of Representatives and senators. Remember, it's a bicameral Congress. And Congress comes from the Latin terms, which is to come together or assemble, like Avengers assemble. In this case, the people assemble. Remember, again, it is a bicameral, which comes again, two houses. And this is rooted in what you studied earlier from the founders of the Constitution, who agreed in the Great Compromise, or also known as the Connecticut Compromise, that the small states and the big states will both basically get what they want. Both of them were threatening, we are not going to be part of a United States if we don't get this very important caveat, and that is being represented the way we think best helps and serves our interests. The small states wanted what's basically the Senate, or a equal representation. And the big states were like, wait a minute, like Virginia, they argued, wait a minute, how can we have equal representation if your state has 5 people and we have 5 million people? So both sides basically said it's not fair. The House of Representatives is then actually more representing the interest of the large states, which is basically what's called proportional representation. Now, I want you to remember that proportional representation it's based on the population. So in this case, both got what they wanted. Both the small states got the Senate and the big states got the House of Representatives based on population. Totally, there are 535 members. There are 100 members in the Senate, 2 per state. So if we added an extra state, if instead of 50 states, 50 times 2 being 100, if we added an extra state and it became now 51 states, then you would have 102 senators. That said, the House of Representatives in, I believe, 1919, 1929 was capped at 435. Initially, with the first Congress in 1789, there was actually only about 30 members in the House of Representatives. But since the population has grown and we have added new states, it has now become 435. Remember, when the Constitution was first ratified, we had 13 states. So we have 435 in the House of Representatives and 100 in the Senate. The House of Representatives, also known as the People's House, right? Because it's based more on population, and it is meant, again, to be representative of the population, while the Senate is called the State House. And up until the 17th Amendment, with the Progressive Era, senators were actually directly chosen by their state legislatures. To become a senator or to become a member of the House of Representatives, there are certain requirements found in Article 1 of the Constitution. In the Senate, you have to be a minimum of 30 years old. You have to have been a citizen for 9 years. Now, this is very interesting because the president has to have been born in the country, all right, or in one of its territories. So technically, you can be an immigrant and have been here for 9+ years and actually run. As a senator, 6-year term, no term limits, meaning you can keep running. And in the House of Representatives, you have to be a minimum of the age of 25. You have to have been a citizen for at least 7 years. And these are 2-year terms, which is very difficult because basically after 1 year, every congressperson representative has to begin to their campaign again and running. So they're constantly running. And there are really pros and cons to this. On one end, they're constantly in touch with their constituents. And remember that word, constituents, those that they represent in their districts. But at the same time, they're constantly raising money, and who gives most money are the lobbyists and the special interests. Now, for both the Senate and the House, you must live in the state that you are representing. It's very interesting. Let's a quick divergent. On average, Each House member represents about 700,000 people today. Remember, it's capped at 435 people, meaning if the population increases, it'll go from 700,000 to maybe 800,000 or even a million. If it decreases, it'll be less than that because it's capped in, I believe, in 1919 or 1929 law, 435 being the max. So if you look at this map, which states currently only have one representative? Now, mind you, even if a state has less than 700,000, let's say they only have 200,000, they still get at least a minimum of one representative. And there are 7 states, plus or minus, it changes it based on the census, that currently have at least, or a minimum, it has one representative, including Alaska, right? Including Delaware, Montana, North Dakota. The House of Representatives and Congress can be one of 2 types of representatives. One of them is called the delegate, where in a sense members of Congress act as if they are representing directly the interest of their constituents in their district or their state. That's called a delegate. While there's another form, it's called they're acting as trustees, meaning they were elected to do what they are going to do. They don't need to go back to their constituents and see how they're feeling and what they think about certain things. Instead, they're trustees, meaning you elected me, let me just do my job. So another reality and something to consider is that members of Congress do not only represent their specific constituents in their district or state, but rather they represent the country as a whole. Remember, this is part of the federal government, meaning the national government. So while they may represent technically their district, but their goal is to also represent what are the larger interests of the country as a whole. And in the process, you find members often resorting to what's called the log rolling effect. Think about the quid pro quo. You scratch my back, I will scratch your back. You vote on my bill and I'll vote on your bill. Now, technically, this is not ethical behavior because you can't just vote for somebody and their bill so that you can get something for yourself. Now, as mentioned, there are only 435 members in the House of Representatives, and currently they represent about 700,000 people. Initially, remember, before they used to represent only about 30,000 people in the first Congress. So now we have 700,000 people, but every 10 years we have what's called a census. The census basically takes a tally of how many people are living in that district, living in that state. And as a result, then it goes through something what's called reapportionment. Reapportionment is after the census is taken, Congress reallocates the House seats based on that population. And so a state or a district may gain or lose. And this also then leads to what's called redistricting, where the districts are literally redrawn to deal with that population as reflected from the census. And what happens when you have no incumbent, or incumbent is someone who is currently in office and running, you have what's called an open seat. So for example, if California suddenly gets an extra seat, it's an open seat. Or for example, if that seat, the person passes away, it's considered what's called an open seat. Usually what happens is seats usually go to a particular political party, meaning a political party usually has a specific district and they tend to keep that district. They don't lose that district. And this happens as a result of this redistricting. Sometimes we go and there is partisan politics and there is a manipulation of that district to serve a particular political advantage or a party or an incumbent. Usually this is illegal. There are times where it's legal. So as a result, you'll see this bottom right picture, looks like a vulture or something, is sometimes you just don't know when a district begins and when it ends. I used to work in a district in California, and it was this sort of gross disruption and distortion, and you didn't know where a district began and where it started because of the manipulation, sort of gerrymandering. Now, as mentioned before, incumbents usually win those particular seats, meaning they're currently in office and they're basically running again, and they're more likely to actually be they're more likely to win again and again and again. So in fact, if you look at House seats, and this is very important, 90% of them basically stay with an incumbent, 90%. So it's very difficult to defeat an incumbent. And what is an incumbent? Again, it's someone who's currently holds office and is running again. And there are a number of reasons why incumbents have an advantage. It's very rare for them to lose because they have a number of advantages, including they tend to have what's called pork barrel projects or earmarks, which basically allow for federal money from the Congress for projects for a particular district or state. And as a result, if you are just elected, for example, and you get money for a bridge to be built or a school to be built in your district, you're more likely to get support from your constituents. And as a result, they'll remember you and vote for you again. So those are pork barrel projects. There's also additional advertising and visibility. You are now known, you have a brand name in a sense, right? If you're a Kennedy, for example, you're more likely to get elected because you have a brand name. In this case, you have also additional advertising benefits. There's something called franking privilege, which basically franking is basically like a stamp or a facsimile of a stamp, and it basically allows you as a incumbent, someone who's in office, to send a mail and to your constituents basically for free, right? And so this is an additional way to let your constituents know who you are. There's casework. If you ever have a problem with a bureaucracy again being sort of like an administrative, unelected part of the government, if you ever have a problem with, let's say, the immigration or with the IRS, you can actually go and complain or ask your member of Congress to help you. So they can actually literally try to represent you. So they'll develop what's called a casework. You will be their case. And they'll act on your behalf. They'll call up the DMV and say, hey, why did you do X, Y, or Z? Position taking, again, we mentioned how if they vote for a particular bill, they're more likely to get the support. Now, just to go back for a moment, one way to defeat an incumbent is if, let's say, the incumbent is currently in a bad economy. So as a result, people have less trust in that member and they're more likely to want someone new. If there is a political scandal, like maybe an affair. Now, how is Congress organized to make policy? In the Constitution, Article 1, you have different powers. In these, you have what's example of something called the enumerated powers, or also known as the express powers. And then you have what's called the elastic clause, or also known as the implied powers. Now, the enumerated powers are the specific powers given to Congress. For example, only Congress can declare war. The president cannot declare war. Now, you may argue, well, Mr. Kira, what about Vietnam? Vietnam and Korea, these are considered police actions, even though we called it the Vietnam War. Technically, Congress never declared war. That's only the purview of the legislative branch. Congress has the power of what's called the purse, meaning they are the ones who collect the money, and they're the ones who also coin the money, meaning they make the money. They pass the laws, while the executive, they execute or enforce the laws, and the judicial, they interpret the laws. So the implied powers, also known as the elastic clause, because these are powers that are provided that Congress has the power to make any law that is basically necessary and proper and passes in the purview of what's allowed in the enumerated or the express powers, meaning very simply, the enumerated or the express powers say you can declare war or you can coin money. The elastic clause says, okay, or the implied is that here we're going to put Mr. Kira, or we're going to put this president on this money. It's basically implied because it is proper and necessary. The House of Representatives have the power to impeach the president. Don't think of impeaching the president as actually formally kicking them out, but rather they have the power to bring charges or to impeach the president, while the Senate's specific responsibility is have a trial. The Senate's also responsibility, and I want you to remember these two words, is advise and consent, meaning they're there to advise the president or the executive branch and to consent, meaning to approve his nominations, whether for the Supreme Court or something else. So the president nominates, the Senate consents, meaning they approve his nominations or not. They also are meant to specifically ratify treaties. So if you think about for World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, it's very interesting. Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, is the one who actually made the recommendation for what's the precursor of the United Nations called the League of Nations. And when he comes back home and he says, look at this amazing thing, the Senate at that time, which was the opposing party, did not, and I remember this R word, did not ratify the treaty, which means the U.S. was never actually a part or ratified or approved the Treaty of Versailles in World War I. So the Senate also ratifies treaties. The president can vote, but it's the Senate that has to approve. And again, that whole consent. The Senate also has another wonderful power called a filibuster. And before I get to that, I want you to understand that the Senate is more informal in structure, meaning they have more leeway and flexibility. And one of these is the filibuster. The filibuster allows an opponent of a bill, for example, and if you want to look at that bottom right, if you ever watch a movie related to a filibuster, and a really great movie called Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, where the Senate or a senator can literally stop a bill by debating endlessly. So in the Senate, there is no time allocation to a particular bill. A senator can basically continue talking and talking once they have the floor. While in the House of Representatives, it's very like, you get 2 minutes, because there's so many people, there's so many representatives. But in the Senate, it's a little bit more informal. And so a filibuster is literally where you can talk a bill to death until finally it may be taken off or delayed or prevented from a vote. Now, there's a way to end a filibuster currently, and that's called a cloture. CLOTUR, where they need basically about 60 votes, 60 senators, 60 out of the 100. And it's very difficult to get because you basically need members generally of both the minority and the majority party.
It's just the blood and bone and sinew of this democracy that some great men handed down to the human race, that's all. But of course, if you've got to build a dam where that boys' camp ought to be, to get some graft to pay off some political army or something, well, that's a different thing. Oh, no. If you think I'm going back there and tell those boys in my state and say, look, now, fellas, forget about it. Forget all this stuff I've been telling you about this land you live in is a lot of hooey. This isn't your country. It belongs to a lot of James Taylors. Oh, no, not me. And anybody here that thinks I'm going to do that, they got another thing coming.
Senator Smith has now talked for 23 hours and 16 minutes. It is the most unusual and spectacular thing in the Senate annals.
The House of Representatives, as mentioned, they have the power to impeach or to bring charges against the president. They are also, revenue bills are specifically only brought up in the House of Representatives. If you look at that bottom picture there, you'll see the last president that was impeached, meaning articles were brought against him, was President Trump. And there were 2 articles. One was abuse of power, and the second was the obstruction of Congress. The Senate, of course, had a trial or a default trial where they did not find him guilty, and therefore he was not forcibly removed from office. And of course, there are other presidents, I believe 3 other presidents who were impeached. There's President Clinton, who was before Trump, for lying. Now, the leadership of Congress is made up of a number of titles, and we'll quickly just go through these. There's the Speaker of the House, currently Nancy Pelosi. The Democrats are in majority, therefore they will have the majority party, and therefore they get to choose the Speaker. Now, the Speaker is chosen by the members of that party in the Congress. The Vice President, which is currently Mike Pence, serves as the head of the Senate, and their role is to basically to break a tie, because the Senate is 100 members. If it's 50-50, the vice president or who's the head of the Senate can actually break a tie. Both the House and the Senate have a majority leader. And again, this is just the party that, in a sense, is in charge based on having more members than the other. So in the Senate, it's currently the Republicans, and then in the House of Representatives, it is currently the Democrats. McConnell being in the Senate and Pelosi being in the House of Representatives. The whip is very interesting. The whip is basically the liaison between the leadership and the members of the members of the party. So this is actually really important because the whip literally whips, in a sense, the members of Congress to doing what the leadership, in a sense, wants. Now, the Senate is led by what's called the Senate Majority Leader, who's currently McConnell. And then there's also a president pro tem who basically rules over the Senate if the vice president is gone, which is most of the time. And that person is the most senior member from the majority party. They have basically the seniority. Now, it's very interesting. For a bill to pass, you need both houses. You cannot just have one house or the other. It takes both houses to pass any legislation. And it's very interesting. Of about, I believe is it 2001, I forgot which year, which session, there was over 5,000 bills that were introduced, I believe 5,500. And of those, most died in what's called committee. So of the 5,500 bills that were introduced, I believe only about 100, little less than 150 bills were actually passed. So remember, a bill must be passed in both houses. So there are many types of committees, and among the more important ones is what's called a standing committee. And this is where it's most durable. It's the permanent committee. For example, you have the health committee and the education committee. And this is where they deal with bills with different legislative areas. So, for example, the Education Committee deals with education. Now, a select or special committee is basically special, meaning that it may not have existed 2 years ago and it may not exist 2 years from now. For example, we currently have, I believe, a COVID-19 committee. And then you also have what's called a joint committee where both the House and the Senate come together to either oversee an investigation or to ask or to see how they can both approve particular bills. In the standing committee, just a quick point, there's different types, including the appropriation committee where money is spent. There's the revenue and budget committees where it's basically money is raised. The rules committee where you have where the rules are determined, and it also includes how many staffers or individual members are, how many individual members get. There's also the authorizing committee, which is what passes the laws that tell government what to do. For example, in the with respect to student aid, there's the Pell Grant program. So they are responsible for overseeing the federal bureaucracy. And again, a bureaucracy is unelected members that do mostly the administrative parts of government. Getting on a committee is usually determined by the caucus, Democratic caucus, Republican caucus, and some of the leadership. And last but not least, I think what's really important to understand is today, unfortunately, we have a very partisan politics where the Democrats, they currently have the House of Representatives as a majority, and the Senate is ruled by has a majority of Republicans. So you have gridlock, meaning there's not much happening, there's not much moving. And as a result, it begs the question, how representative are these representatives? Are they serving the best interest of their constituents, of the country as a whole? Unfortunately, partisanship has only increased. And so we will see with your generation, hopefully we'll find a way to have our differences, but at the same time, find a way to reconcile those differences to serve the best interest of the entire country. If you like this video, be sure to like below and hit the bell next to the subscribe button for future videos.